The topic of today's lecture is Edgar Allan Poe's poetry. I will start with an introduction to his poetics, his theory of poetry, before moving on to a short analysis of 11 representative poems, including Ulalume and Annabel Lee. Some important pieces like The Raven and the Bells will be treated in separate lectures. Poe defined poetry as the rhythmical creation of beauty, a phrase I adopted for the title of this presentation. This definition of poetry was most clearly articulated and refined in a series of reviews, essays, and lectures Poe published throughout the 1840s. The most important of these is an 1842 review of Longfellow's poems for Graham's magazine. Longfellow, you may recall, would come to embody everything Poe found faulty in American literary culture. This article was an early broadside in Poe's self-proclaimed war against Longfellow, which would climax in 1845 in the pages of the Broadway Journal. What's more important for us is not what he says about Longfellow in this article, but what he says about poetry in general. Poe later reworked these ideas into a lecture that drew large audiences in cities like Providence and Richmond. In 1850, nearly a year after his death, the lecture was published as The Poetic Principle in Sartain's Union magazine, which earlier that year had also printed his last poem, Annabel Lee. In March 1843, 11 months after his Longfellow review, Notes upon English Verse appeared in James Russell Lowell's Pioneer magazine. By 1848, Poe had reworked it into a long essay printed across 2 consecutive issues of the Southern Literary Messenger. It is not particularly useful for novice readers, nor on certain points is it entirely persuasive, but it is Poe's most sustained analysis of English prosody, in which he proposes a mathematical explanation for the positive effects of meter and rhyme on the mind and ear of the reader. Finally, in 1846, Poe published The Philosophy of Composition, which is not a review per se, but a rather arch commentary on his own poem, The Raven, which had enjoyed enormous success throughout the preceding year. He explains in detail how he came up with the idea and aesthetic considerations that shaped its composition. Reading this piece, one has to be wary of Poe's irony, but his ideas are generally consistent with points he made in his reviews and public lectures. For anyone new to Poe's poetry, it's important to understand, first of all, what he values, what he thinks poetry is for, and the surest way for the poet to achieve those goals. To clarify these points, I'm going to emphasize 3 overlapping ideas: beauty, melancholia, and prosody. For Poe, what distinguishes poetry from other modes of writing is the pursuit of beauty. While some writing seeks to discover truth, to improve our understanding of the world, and some writing seeks to guide our conduct in the world, appealing to our rational and moral senses respectively, poetry, he says, aims higher. It should raise our thoughts and feelings to the contemplation of ideas beyond gross material facts. Truth and duty, he says, are best communicated through prose. Beauty alone is the province of poetry. To try to bend poetry to fit within the objectives of the philosopher or moralist, objectives for which it is ill-suited, is what he calls the heresy of the didactic. The primary purpose of poetry is not instruction, he argues, but pleasure. The best kind of poem, to quote a famous sentence from The Poetic Principle, is a poem and nothing more, a poem written solely for the poem's sake. In the Longfellow review, he writes, "An important condition of man's immortal nature is the sense of the beautiful. It is the desire of the moth for the star. It is not the mere appreciation of the beauty before us. It is a wild effort to reach the beauty above. It is a forethought of the loveliness to come. It is a passion to be satiated by no sublunary sights or sounds or sentiments, and the soul thus athirst strives to allay its fever in futile efforts at creation. Those are Poe's italics there on the word creation. He means by that art, artistic creation, music, poetry. Inspired with the prescient ecstasy of the beauty beyond the grave, it struggles by multiform novelty of combination among the things and thoughts of time to anticipate some portion of that loveliness whose very elements, perhaps, appertain solely to eternity. And the result of such effort on the part of souls fittingly constituted is alone what mankind have agreed to denominate poetry. A crucial phrase in this passage is novelty of combination among the things and thoughts of time. In other words, the earthbound poet must work with the materials he has at hand: language, pleasurable sensations, even the poetic and intellectual legacy of those who came before him to apprehend the ideal. The problem for the poet is that these materials, however pleasurable in themselves, are inherently, irremediably flawed. For a poem to be effective, then, it must be novel. It must perceive the world afresh, explore new regions, introduce new ideas. Failing to achieve the highest, it must yet achieve something never attempted before. So what then is the stuff of poetry? Poe tells us, I'm going to read a longer passage here, that he perceives it in the songs of birds, in the sighing of the night wind, in the repining voice of the forest, in the surf that complains to the shore, in the fresh breath of the woods, in the scent of the violet, in the voluptuous perfume of the hyacinth, in the suggestive odor that comes to him at eventide from far distant, undiscovered islands over dim oceans, illimitable and unexplored. He feels it in the beauty of woman, in the grace of her step, in the luster of her eye, in the melody of her voice, in her soft laughter, in her sigh, in the harmony of the rustling of her robes. But above all, far above all, he kneels to it, he worships it in the faith, in the purity, in the strength, in the altogether divine majesty of her love. Of all the passions affecting the human heart, for Poe, it is love that is most beautiful. Unlike lust, which is physical and therefore degrading to the spirit, love elevates the soul, he says, and therefore is unquestionably the purest and truest of all poetical themes. Despite all these earthly, or as Poe would have it, sublunary pleasures, however, even the most beautiful poem ever written can give us but a faint glimpse of the beyond. Like the desire of the moth for the star, the poet may succeed at stirring our spirit, at raising our awareness of the ideal, and make us aspire towards it. But poetry alone cannot transport us there. We always turn the page and come back to dull reality, which is why there's always a soupçon of disappointment mingled with Poe's pleasure, an undertone of sadness or melancholy in his appreciation of beauty. The tone of beauty's highest manifestation, he writes, is one of sadness. Beauty of whatever kind, in its supreme development, invariably excites the sensitive soul to tears. Melancholy is thus the most legitimate of all the poetical tones. His most famous, perhaps infamous, expression of this idea appears in The Philosophy of Composition. I asked myself, he writes, of all melancholy topics, what, according to the universal understanding of mankind, is the most melancholy? Death, was the obvious reply. And when, I said, is this most melancholy of topics most poetical? The answer here also is obvious, when it most closely allies itself to beauty. The death, then, of a beautiful woman is unquestionably the most poetical topic in the world, and equally is it beyond doubt that the lips best suited for such topic are those of a bereaved lover. We'll come back to that later in this presentation. By prosody, we generally mean the musical qualities of poetry, its rhythmical qualities, its metrical structure, its patterns of rhyming words, and other auricular effects, alliteration, onomatopoeia, and so forth. By such means, the poem itself becomes an object of beauty, not just arbitrary words strung across the page or streaming from the poet's lips, but a careful arrangement of sounds, the effects of which transcend even their meaning. In the poetic principle, he states, it is in music, perhaps, that the soul most nearly attains the great end for which, when inspired with the poetic sentiment, it struggles, the creation of supernal beauty. It may be, indeed, that here, in music, this sublime end is, now and then, attained in fact. We are often made to feel with a shivering delight that from an earthly harp are stricken notes which cannot have been unfamiliar to the angels. And thus there can be little doubt that in the union of poetry with music in its popular sense, we shall find the widest field for the poetic development. In the earlier, somewhat more strongly worded version of this argument included in his review of Longfellow, he claims that prosody is not merely ancillary, but absolutely essential to poetry. The elements of that beauty which is felt in sound may be the mutual or common heritage of earth and heaven. Music, in its modifications of rhythm and rhyme, is of so vast a moment in poesy as never to be neglected by him who is truly poetical, is of so mighty a force in furthering the great aim intended that he is mad who rejects its assistance. From the outset of his career, Poe saw himself as a poet. His first 3 books were collections of poems, all self-published or privately funded. In the preface to his 4th book, The Raven, and other poems in 1845, he writes, under happier circumstances, by which he almost certainly means financial circumstances, poetry would have been the field of my choice. For Poe, writing stories was, in the early days especially, the more reliable path to earn a modest living. Poetry, he says, he could never write with an eye to the paltry compensations or the more paltry commendations of mankind. Compared to popular, highly commended contemporaries like Longfellow, Poe's poetic output is slim. Life's more urgent, practical demands compelled him to pursue other ventures, but he never completely abandoned poetry. Over half the poems we're reading appeared in the 4 collections of poetry Poe printed between 1827 and 1845. There's Tamerlane, which contains a dream, and the lake. That was 1827, and then a couple years later it came to Al-Araf, which contains the sonnet to science. And then in 1831, his poems, which contains City in the Sea, which in this collection is titled The Doomed City, and also The Sleeper, which here is called Irene. And then finally, in 1845, The Raven and Other Poems, which contains Dreamland, and The Raven, which will be a topic for a separate lecture. So I'm going to rearrange these poems into 2 categories, which I'll explain in a minute. But first, there are several more poems I'm going to talk about in this lecture that did not appear in print until after these 4 volumes were published, and one of them alone not until a quarter century after Poe's death. Most of these are love poems, Ulalume, To Helen, For Annie, and Annabel Lee, which is his last poem, and then Alone, which was written around 1829, but again, not published until 1875. To organize this presentation, I've divided all the poems into 2 groups, as you can see, under 2 headings, the poet on the left and the beautiful woman on the right. Since most of the poems listed under the first group, the poet, were printed or written long before the ones under the beautiful woman, I'm going to start with these. The prosody of Poe's early poems is relatively conventional. The Lake, Alone, and City in the Sea are written in tetrameter couplets. A Dream is in a ballad measure of alternating tetrameter and trimeter rhyming lines, and To Science is a standard English sonnet with 3 quatrains and a couplet. Only Dreamland, a much later poem than the others in this group, shows a more mature, fluent poet experimenting with complex metrical patterns and rhyming effects. In particular, we can see Poe's penchant for the trochee. This is a disyllabic foot consisting of a stressed followed by an unstressed syllable, the inverse of the iamb, as well as carefully placed catalectic lines in which the final unstressed syllable is dropped. I have reached these lands but newly, from an ultimate dim Thule, from a wild, weird clime that lieth sublime out of space, out of time. The first couplet, lines 5 and 6, is trochaic tetrameter, that is 4 consecutive trochees. The second couplet, however, lines 7 and 8, adds variation. The last line, line 8, is catalectic, with the long pause in the middle indicated by the dash, standing in for the second unstressed syllable following space. A fourth unstressed syllable should come after the word time as well, but Poe elects to end the first stanza on a stressed syllable. The first line of the second couplet, on the other hand, line 7, is hypercatalectic. That is, after 4 consecutive trochees, he tacks on an extra syllable with the word sublime. Poe's early poems also reveal his inclination for Byronic posturing. In my lecture on William Wilson, I speak a little more about the influence of the English Romantic poet Lord Byron, but the basic idea is that the poet adopts the lyrical persona of the alienated genius, a misunderstood social outcast who prefers to be alone in the world, identifies with Satan and historic figures of a rebellious or eccentric character, and he's often morbidly attracted to death, decay, and dark supernatural forces. From the poems in this group, we see the plainest expression of Poe's Byronic exceptionalism expressed in Alone. From childhood's hour I have not been as others were, I have not seen as others saw, I could not bring my passions from a common spring, and all I loved alone. The poet is different from ordinary people. His imagination is more vivid, he feels things more acutely, and this gives him a sense of his own superiority to others. Thus separated from the rest of mankind, he identifies more with tormented demons than with angels. Toward the end of the poem, when he gazes into the blue sky overhead and he observes a solitary cloud there, it takes the form of a demon in his imagination. Closely related to this Byronic solitariness is the poet's rejection of the everyday world, which is too dull, too ugly, too crassly materialistic for his more ethereal sensibility. He prefers a world cast half in shadow to avoid the harsh glare of external reality. He retreats inward into twilight realms of fancy, of dream, and visionary experience. Perhaps his most succinct expression of this attitude is the sonnet To Science, where he rejects empirical reasoning, allegorized here as the vulture whose wings are dull realities, and instead celebrates the power of the imagination to transcend reality, a power embodied by the dreamy poet recumbent in the shade of the tamarind tree, seeking for treasure in the jeweled skies. Desire for this ideal existence is pervasive in the early lyrics. In the poem A Dream, for example, the speaker dwells in some vague past, recalling a once happier life that's been lost or taken away from him, but that serves now as a kind of mournful beacon guiding him through a physical world that matters little to him. That holy dream That holy dream, while all the world were chiding, hath cheered me as a lovely beam, a lonely spirit guiding. And again, the lake, with its imposing natural boundaries of volcanic cliffs and trees, provides a quiet, hidden sanctuary from mundane reality and satisfies the self-absorbed poet's desire for solitude. So lovely was the loneliness of a wild lake with black rock bound and the tall pines that towered around. But this lovely loneliness also takes on a distinctly morbid tone, as death is the ultimate isolation and rejection of the corporeal world. Death was in that poisonous wave, and in its gulf a fitting grave for him who thence could solace bring to his lone imagining, whose solitary soul could make an Eden of that dim lake. Even though Dreamland did not appear until many years after these early poems, it appeared in Graham's magazine in 1844, it shows Poe's continual longing for an existence out of space, out of time. A remote sanctuary for the heart whose woes are legion, he writes, a peaceful, soothing region that's only accessible through a soporific imagination. The sad soul that here passes, he writes, beholds it but through darkened glasses. Dreamland also gives an example of a unique form of beauty, a pleasure derived not from the contemplation of moonlit flowers or the scintillating eyes of a woman, but from the contemplation of natural forms and forces that impose limitations on human perception, diminish human agency, and sometimes are even life-threatening. The 19th century term for this pleasure was the sublime. In the arts, sublimity was associated or achieved with darkness, vast spaces, tremendous physical forms, and sensorily overwhelming natural phenomena like storms, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions. Dreamland contains a lengthy catalog of such images. Bottomless vales and boundless floods and chasms and caves and titan woods with forms that no man can discover for the dews that drip all over. Mountains toppling evermore into seas without a shore, seas that restlessly aspire, surging unto skies of fire, lakes that endlessly outspread their lone waters, lone and dead. In the lake, the poet emphasizes that a scene of utter desolation can also be a source of pleasure. The terror of the lone lake, he says, was not fright, but a tremulous delight. And it is interesting to compare the effect of the lake on his imagination to that of the dismal tarn in The Fall of the House of Usher, where the narrator explicitly states that the reflection of the house and trees into the surface of the water is incapable of stimulating any sensation of the sublime. The City in the Sea also contains distinct echoes of the narrator's description of the house, which in the end suffers a similar, albeit improbable fate when it splits in half and sinks down into the tarn. The city described in the poem is no specific place, but a visionary city of death, a nightmarish, tenuous world that appeals to the poet's sense of isolation, suffering, and fatality. Despite the numerous similarities between poem and tale, it does seem to me that Poe is focused in the poem on achieving very different aesthetic outcomes. Sublime pleasure in the poem and abject fear in the story. I'll be interested to hear what you think about this comparison in class discussion. Proceeding now with the second group of poems under the heading The Beautiful Woman. There are 5 of them. The earliest, The Sleeper, appeared under the title Irene in the 1831 volume of poems. And consistent with Poe's earliest verses, it's composed in tetrameter couplets. To Helen, on the other hand, is atypical in that it's written in blank verse or unrhymed iambic pentameter. That's very unusual for Poe. The later poems in this group display highly complex metrical patterns and innovative rhyme schemes that often rely on repetition and refrain, giving them an enchanting incantatory quality. Annabel Lee, for instance, follows a heavily anapestic ballad measure of alternating tetrameter and trimeter lines with the same rhyming words, see, lee, me, appearing in every stanza, culminating with the haunting final couplet. And the stars never rise, but I feel the bright eyes of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And so all the night tide I lie down by the side of my darling, my life and my bride, in her sepulchre there by the sea, in her tomb by the sounding sea. The last line is catalectic, with an unstressed syllable missing from the last foot, turning what should be an anapest or two unstressed followed by a stressed syllable into an iamb, or a single unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. One of Poe's most musical poems, and a favorite of mine, is Ulalume. It's a virtuoso experiment in prosody, composed mostly in trimeter lines, each line having 3 stressed syllables. It is predominantly anapestic. Again, that's 2 unstressed syllables followed by a stressed syllable, but utilizing other metrical feet as well to enhance the dreamy, somnambulistic atmosphere and uncertain tone of the speaker as he wanders through the night against the advice of his soul psyche, subconsciously guided by the planetary influence of Astarte or Venus towards the tomb of his deceased love. There's a great deal of repetition. Most stanzas in Ulalume contain 3 or 4 identical rhyming words, which greatly enhances the poem's hypnotic incantatory effects. The skies, they were ashen and sober. The leaves, they were crisped and sere. The leaves, they were withering and sere. It was night in the lonesome October of my most immemorial year. It was hard by the dim lake of Auber in the misty mid-region of Weir. It was down by the dank tarn of Auber in the ghoul-haunted woodland of Weir. The English poet Theodore Watts Dunton said Ulalume has the same effect on the reader as music. The mere sounds of the words, in sibilant combinations and monotonous reiterations, convey meanings above and apart from their dictionary definitions. Ulalume, properly intoned, he writes, would produce something like the same effect upon a listener knowing no word of English that it produces upon us. Ulalume was published anonymously in the American Review in December 1847. The same year, Poe's wife, Virginia, died. As you can see, it originally carried a dedication, also anonymous, but most likely to Virginia, which was eventually dropped from later printings. The anonymity was a marketing ploy to stoke speculation among readers and draw attention to the American Review magazine. Who could have written such a strange and beautiful poem, and for whom was it written? This stunt went terribly awry, however, so that a year later Poe reprinted the poem in the Providence Journal with an introduction identifying himself as the undisputed author. Apparently, doubts as to his original authorship lingered as late as 1849 when the poem appeared in the New York Literary World with the following headnote from the editor. The following fascinating poem, which is from the pen of Edgar A. Poe, has been drifting about in the newspapers under anonymous or mistaken imputation of authorship, having been attributed to N.P. Willis. We now restore it to its proper owner. It originally appeared without name in the American Review. In peculiarity of versification and a certain cold moonlight witchery, it has much of the power of the author's raven. As Poe explains in The Poetic Principle, love is the most pleasurable of all human passions, and therefore the truest and purest of all poetical themes, and it is the beauty of woman above all that inspires this passion in him. When he describes feminine beauty, it is often in symbolic and idealized terms. The women in his poems seem to spring from his imagination rather than from real life. They appear angelic, more spiritual than physical. A good example is the poem To Helen. We know Poe composed this poem with a specific woman in mind, Sarah Helen Whitman, in the summer of 1848. No other woman in Poe's later years seems to have inspired him with more intense romantic feelings. A few months after sending her a copy of the poem, he asked for her hand in marriage, and her ultimate refusal led to a failed attempt to overdose on laudanum or on opium, which is perhaps the subject of his poem for Annie. In To Helen, she is idealized beyond recognition, described as pale, somnolent, and morose. Clad all in white upon a violent bank, I saw thee half reclining, while the moon fell on the upturned faces of the roses, and on thine own upturned, alas, in sorrow. And as the landscape around her grows dim, she, of course, becomes increasingly beautiful, dreamy, and otherworldly. There's a spectral luminosity he observes in her eyes, which is a recurrent motif in Poe's love poems. We see it again in the last lines of For Annie, and in the tales, too, in the character of Ligeia, for instance, whose lustrous, bewitching eyes convey more malevolent forces. Even after Helen has gone from the speaker's presence, she lives on in his memory, perhaps more vividly than in real life. And thou, a ghost, amid the entombing trees didst glide away. Only thine eyes remained. They would not go. They never yet have gone. For Annie is a more puzzling, more ambiguous poem in which the speaker appears to be neither living nor dead. There is no critical consensus on this question, but lying in a kind of semi-death, a state of suspended animation that relieves him from what he twice refers to as the fever called living, and yet he's able to express his love for a woman, Annie, whose real name was Nancy Locke Heywood, to whom Poe had written an impassioned letter relating his suicide attempt. In the poem, she comforts him and embodies his cherished ideals of supernal beauty and maternal solicitude, and yet she seems less a real woman than a figment of his semi-conscious thoughts and dreams. For Annie is also unusual in that the poet represents himself as being dead, or at least in a state very near to death, rather than as the bereft lover. I rest so contentedly now in my bed, he says, that you shudder to look at me, thinking me dead. As we see in more famous poems like Ulalume and The Raven, however, the roles are often reversed. In The Philosophy of Composition, remember, Poe states that the death of a beautiful woman is unquestionably the most poetical topic in the world, and equally is it beyond doubt that the lips best suited for such topic are those of a bereaved lover. Poe's poems about dead women, Irene, Ulalume, Lenore, in The Raven, Annabel Lee, are the most familiar to modern readers. There's a hazy indefiniteness about them, a lugubrious dreaminess. The poet seems only semi-conscious of the waking world. Not even the women seem real. We learn their musical names, which often carry mythical or mystical associations. We know they're supernally beautiful, resembling heavenly rather than earthly bodies. We know the poet loved them in life and perhaps loves them even more in death, but they have little history of their own, no independent agency, no identity beyond what he imagines them to be. They're dead or semi-dead, and he seems to prefer them that way. Indeed, if they were to speak back from beyond the grave, it might dispel the sorrow in which he takes so much pleasure. In the final lines of The Sleeper, a poem Poe once declared his personal favorite, he imagines Irene as a child playing in a graveyard, naively throwing pebbles at the heavy iron doors of the family mausoleum as she imagines the dead inside calling out in response. He seems almost relieved that she can no longer disturb their silence, that she now lies alongside them, forever with unopened eye, in enduring, imperturbable silence. Some sepulchre remote, alone, against whose portals she hath thrown in childhood many an idle stone, some tomb from out whose sounding door she ne'er shall force an echo more, thrilling to think, poor child of sin, it was the dead who groaned within. Finally, the last poem I'm going to talk about is Annabel Lee. It is believed to be the last poem Poe wrote before his sudden death in the fall of 1849, and several manuscript versions in his own hand survive today. He would present these as tokens of friendship or as partial payment for debts he owed, and this became something of a problem after Poe's death, as several individuals who had received autographed copies of the poem recognized the opportunity to profit from its publication, and it quickly appeared in the Richmond Examiner, the New York Tribune, and the Southern Literary Messenger. But before he died, Poe had sold the poem to John Sartain for publication in the Union magazine, which for some reason Sartain delayed until January 1850, so that when he finally printed it, he added a headnote of explanation. In the December number of our magazine, we announced that we had another poem of Mr. Poe's in hand, which we would publish in January. We supposed it to be his last, as we received it from him a short time before his decease. The sheet containing our announcement was scarcely dry from the press before we saw the poem, which we had bought and paid for, going the rounds of the newspaper press, into which it had found its way through some agency that will perhaps be hereafter explained. Annabel Lee reprises the theme of Ulalume. A distraught lover finds his way through darkness to the tomb of his beloved, but whereas in the former poem, remembrance of lost love becomes a source of torment, here it is proof that love endures beyond the grave. And neither the angels in heaven above, nor the demons down under the sea, can ever dissever my soul from the soul of the beautiful Annabel Lee. Many women would later step forward claiming to be the original Annabel Lee. Sarah Helen Whitman, of course, was one. Poe's first teenage love, Elmira Royster, was another. And several other women of Poe's acquaintance threw their names in the ring as well. Apparently peeved by these ghoulish speculations, Francis Osgood declared it could only be about his deceased wife, Virginia, the only woman he ever truly loved, according to her. The dreamy vagueness of the poem, what kingdom is this, by what sea, and the somewhat banal conventionality of some of Poe's expressions, however beautifully cadenced, prevents us from saying anything definitive. The only sensible conclusion, perhaps, is that the poem is a distillation of a lifetime of serial heartbreaks, the loss of his mother in early childhood, the broken engagements that bookended his adult life, and of course, Virginia's long, wasting illness and eventual death. So I will end on that sad note, and I will have more to say about two more of his poems, The Raven and The Bells, later in this lecture series.